The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel cast dancing patterns across polished marble floors as 300 of Manhattan's wealthiest citizens gathered in the grand ballroom for the annual Westwood Medical Empire Charity Gala. Women draped in designer gowns exchanged air kisses, while men in custom tuxedos discussed quarterly earnings over champagne that cost more per bottle than most New York families spent on groceries in a month. At the center of it all stood Richard Westwood, silver-haired and commanding in his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, raising a glass to toast his cardiac research foundation that bore his family name. His daughter Sophia, 19 and radiant in pale blue silk that matched her eyes, stood beside him, smiling dutifully for the cameras, though her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the microphone to thank the generous donors. Then she gasped, her smile faltering, and clutched at her chest. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor. She collapsed in a heap of silk and diamonds, while 300 people screamed and surged forward in panic. Someone shouted for a doctor, and at least 15 physicians rushed to her side. Another voice called for the automated external defibrillator, and hotel staff ran to the emergency medical cabinet, mounted near the ballroom entrance. But when they tore open the bright red cabinet and pulled out the device, its screen flickered with cascading error messages in angry red text. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Outside the service entrance where kitchen staff carried garbage to the dumpsters, a black woman in torn jeans and a stained jacket pressed her weathered face against the cold glass door, watching the chaos unfold inside the glittering ballroom, and she spoke 7 words that would shatter everything Richard Westwood believed about power, worth, and justice. I can fix that for food. Grace Chen had not always lived in the shadows between dumpsters behind the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district. 5 years ago, she had walked these same streets in tailored blazers and Italian leather heels that clicked with confident purpose against the sidewalks. Back then, she carried a monogrammed leather briefcase containing patents and prototypes that would revolutionize emergency cardiac care technology. She had been Dr. Grace Chen, MIT class of 2003, Phyt in biomedical engineering with highest honors, holder of 15 patents in cardiac rhythm analysis and automated emergency response systems. Her corner office on the 32nd floor of the Westwood Medical Innovation Center had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Her spacious apartment in Brooklyn Heights featured exposed brick walls and a view of the East River that she watched each morning while drinking fair trade Ethiopian coffee. Her son Marcus attended an elite private school where teachers called him gifted and predicted he would follow his mother into engineering. Her husband James worked in investment banking, and they spent weekends touring houses in Westchester County with yards large enough for the golden retriever they planned to adopt. Grace had led a team of 12 brilliant engineers developing the next generation of automated external defibrillators, devices that could analyze complex cardiac rhythms with unprecedented accuracy and deliver precisely calibrated life-saving electrical shocks in those critical moments when seconds meant the difference between survival and death. She spent countless nights in the laboratory perfecting algorithms, running thousands of simulations, testing every possible failure mode and edge case, because she understood with crystal clarity that when her technology reached hospitals and public spaces across America, real human beings would trust their lives to the quality of her work. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now, a story she sometimes told herself on freezing nights when sleep would not come and hunger gnawed at her belly. Richard Westwood had built his $3 billion medical technology empire on a philosophy he repeated like gospel to investors, journalists, and anyone else who would listen. The free market rewards innovation and efficiency above all else, he would say with absolute conviction. And those individuals who cannot maintain the pace of progress have only themselves to blame for their failures. At 55, he commanded a medical device empire spanning 4 continents, with manufacturing facilities in 12 countries and products installed in every major hospital system throughout North America and Western Europe. The Westwood name appeared in gold letters on hospital wings, research centers, and university buildings from Boston to Los Angeles. His face had graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Business Week more times than he bothered to count anymore. He sat on 3 presidential advisory councils, spoke at the World Economic Forum in Davos about the future of healthcare innovation, and had been called a visionary by the Wall Street Journal. Tonight's gala, officially organized to raise funds for cardiac disease research, served primarily as an annual reminder to New York's elite that Richard Westwood remained the single most powerful and influential figure in medical technology. His daughter Sophia stood beside him throughout the evening as living proof of his personal triumph over medical adversity, though very few guests knew the carefully guarded truth about her condition. She had been born with a complex congenital heart defect requiring 3 open heart surgeries before her 10th birthday and lifelong monitoring by a team of specialists. Richard had poured tens of millions into cardiac research partly from genuine desire to help other families facing similar challenges, but mostly because he could not tolerate the thought that his own bloodline carried such fundamental weakness. He kept Sophia's medical history carefully hidden from the press and business partners, crafting instead an elaborate public narrative of a healthy, accomplished young woman about to begin undergraduate studies at Princeton University. When she swayed slightly during his toast and reached out to steady herself against the podium, he assumed she had simply been standing too long in uncomfortable heels. The professional relationship between Grace Chen and Richard Westwood had ended 5 years ago in a windowless conference room on the 32nd floor of the Westwood Medical Innovation Center, though the mechanisms of its destruction had been set in motion months earlier during the final testing phases of their flagship product launch. Grace had discovered critical and potentially fatal flaws in the firmware architecture of their new IED product line during the mandatory safety validation testing. The device exhibited catastrophic failure modes under specific but not uncommon conditions when multiple cardiac rhythmanalysis algorithms attempted to run simultaneously, creating what she documented in her technical reports as a dangerous race condition that could prevent shock delivery during ventricular fibrillation, the most deadly form of cardiac arrest. She had documented everything with meticulous precision, created detailed technical specifications for the required fixes, and presented her findings directly to Richard in a 9-minute meeting where she recommended delaying the product launch by at least 6 months to completely redesign the affected subsystems. Richard had listened with barely concealed impatience, his manicured fingers drumming an irritated rhythm against the polished mahogany conference table while his jaw muscles clenched tighter with each slide of her presentation. 6 months would cost them critical market positioning against their primary competitor, who was racing to launch a similar device. 6 months would disappoint major institutional investors who had been explicitly promised third-quarter revenue from this product line. 6 months represented approximately $40 million in lost profits and damaged credibility with Wall Street analysts. He told Grace in a tone that brooked no argument to sign off on the existing design and develop a software patch that could be deployed later after the initial launch. Grace refused without hesitation. She could not in good conscience approve a medical device she knew contained flaws that could result in patient deaths when deployed in real emergency situations. Richard's face had hardened into something cold and frightening that Grace had never seen before in 3 years of working under his leadership. If you cannot function as a team player, Dr. Chen, perhaps you are not the right cultural fit for this organization. Grace thought he simply meant to fire her, and she steeled herself for that outcome, already mentally preparing to update her resume and reach out to contacts at competing firms. She had not anticipated the thoroughness and viciousness of the destruction he would orchestrate. Grace had believed with her whole heart that Richard Westwood represented everything admirable about American innovation, entrepreneurship, and technological progress when she eagerly accepted his job offer fresh from completing her doctoral dissertation at MIT. He spoke with genuine eloquence about technology serving humanity's highest needs, about the profound moral imperative that engineers carried to create devices that would save lives regardless of patient wealth, insurance status, or demographic background. He had recruited her specifically and personally, he told her over an expensive dinner at Per Se, because he deeply valued diverse perspectives and wanted to bring aboard the brilliant young black woman whose groundbreaking dissertation on advanced cardiac rhythm analysis algorithms had won the prestigious Whittaker Award for Excellence in Biomedical Engineering. Grace poured herself into the work with devotion that bordered on obsessive compulsion and consumed her entire existence. She arrived at the laboratory before sunrise and left long after midnight 6 days every week. She missed her son's lead role in the school play, forgot her wedding anniversary dinner reservation, and skipped her father's 70th birthday celebration because Richard needed the prototype ready for a critical investor presentation. She published peer-reviewed papers in top journals with the Westwood medical name prominently featured in the affiliations, building their scientific reputation and credibility in academic circles where it mattered most. She mentored younger engineers with patience and generosity and defended the company's mission and ethics at professional conferences when competitors whispered about corner cutting. When talented colleagues received lucrative offers from competing firms, Grace stayed loyal because she genuinely believed in Richard's stated vision of putting patient safety above profit margins. She had trusted him completely and without reservation, and that trust had been weaponized against her with cold, calculated precision that destroyed everything she had built. The lawsuit alleging corporate espionage and fraud drained her entire life savings paying for legal defense. The formal accusations of research misconduct made her completely unhireable anywhere in her field. Her husband James, unable to handle the overwhelming stress and social humiliation among their professional circles, filed for divorce and won primary custody of their son by successfully arguing that Grace's emotional instability and unemployment made her an unfit parent. She lost the beautiful apartment, then the car, then finally any pretense of middle-class stability. The descent into homelessness happened faster than she would have imagined possible for someone with her education and credentials. Grace had managed to keep 2 precious items safe through 5 brutal years of sleeping in subway stations, public libraries, and hospital emergency room waiting areas, 5 years of eating from restaurant dumpsters, and begging for spare change on street corners. The first was a battered leather notebook with water-stained pages containing her original handwritten design specifications for the AED system, including detailed technical documentation of the firmware vulnerabilities she had identified and the specific fixes she had proposed. She had grabbed it from her desk during those final chaotic minutes before security guards escorted her from the building, with her few personal belongings hastily shoved into a cardboard box. The second item was a small USB flash drive stored in a safety deposit box at a community credit union in the Bronx, one of the very few financial institutions willing to serve clients without permanent addresses. She paid the $5 monthly storage fee from whatever money she could collect through panhandling, returning aluminum cans, or occasional day labor jobs. The drive contained complete encrypted backups of her email correspondence with Richard and other executives, internal company documents clearly showing she had been explicitly ordered to approve designs she considered unsafe, and time-stamped records of her repeated objections and warnings about patient safety. She had created the backup system automatically through her personal cloud storage, not from any prescient knowledge that she would desperately need this evidence someday, but simply because she was methodical and careful about documentation in all aspects of her professional work. For 5 years, she had carried this evidence like a sacred talisman, neither actively seeking to use it for revenge nor willing to let it disappear into oblivion. Tonight, watching through the smudged glass of the service entrance as Sophia Westwood collapsed and panicked guests screamed for medical help, Grace finally understood with absolute clarity why fate had compelled her to preserve this proof. The AED that hotel staff members pulled from the emergency medical cabinet mounted on the ballroom wall was a Westwood Medical Model AC-450 third generation, the exact device she had refused to approve 5 years ago. She recognized it instantly from its distinctive blue and white protective casing and the specific button layout she had designed herself. When the screen lit up with cascading error messages in angry red text, Grace knew with perfect certainty exactly which subsystem had failed and exactly how to bypass it manually. Grace knocked on the glass with the scarred knuckles of her right hand, the sound barely audible over the commotion of 300 people shouting and crying inside the ballroom. A security guard in a crisp navy uniform with polished brass buttons glanced toward the service entrance, registered her torn and stained clothing, her unwashed face, her matted hair, and made a sharp dismissive gesture for her to move along and stop bothering the guests. She knocked again, much harder this time, ignoring the pain in her knuckles, and raised her voice to cut through the thick glass barrier. That device is failing because of a race condition in the cardiac rhythm analysis module, and I am the only person in this entire building who knows how to manually bypass the firmware lockout. The security guard hesitated, clearly uncertain whether he was dealing with a delusional homeless person or something else he could not quite categorize. Richard Westwood appeared behind the guard, drawn by the unusual disturbance at the service entrance, and his face went through a remarkable transformation when he recognized the woman whose life he had systematically destroyed 5 years ago. For one long, suspended moment their eyes met through the cold glass, separated by wealth and power and history and hatred, while his only daughter lay dying 20 feet away, surrounded by people who possessed impressive credentials, but not the specific knowledge required to save her. Grace watched him calculate the impossible odds, watched desperate paternal love war against pride and contempt on his aristocratic features, watched the exact instant when fear overwhelmed his arrogance. He gave a single curt nod to the security guard, and the heavy door swung open, letting in the cold October night air along with the woman whose very existence he had tried to erase from the world. Grace stepped across the threshold from darkness into warmth and brilliant light, and the shocked silence of Manhattan's wealthiest elite, her torn canvas sneakers leaving dirty footprints on marble floors that cost more per square foot than she had earned in an entire year of panhandling, and she walked toward the malfunctioning device with the steady confidence of someone who had built it with her own hands and knew every circuit, every line of code, every dangerous vulnerability that corporate greed had refused to address. Grace dropped to her knees beside the malfunctioning device, her worn canvas sneakers leaving dark smudges on the pristine white marble that some worker had polished to mirror brightness just hours before. Her hands trembled as she reached for the AED, not from uncertainty about her technical knowledge, but from the overwhelming flood of emotions crashing through her body after 5 years of exile and humiliation. She remembered every late night spent in the laboratory, perfecting this exact system, every line of code she had written and tested, every circuit pathway she had traced with meticulous care, because she believed this technology would save lives across America. Now she knelt before it as a woman the world had discarded, preparing to prove her worth to people who saw her as something dirty and disposable. Behind her she heard Richard Westwood's voice, sharp with authority, directing the security guards to watch her closely, to be ready to remove her forcibly at the first sign she was wasting their time. Several guests pulled out their phones to record the spectacle, some whispering that this would make an incredible story for their social media followers. Sophia lay motionless on the cold floor nearby, her pale blue dress spread around her like the petals of a dying flower, while Dr. Harrison and 2 other physicians knelt beside her performing chest compressions that grew more frantic with each passing second. Grace forced herself to block out the noise and chaos, to find that calm, focused state she had cultivated during her years as an engineer when complex problems required absolute concentration. She opened the device casing with practiced efficiency, and her eyes immediately found the firmware version display showing 2. 3. One, exactly as she had feared, exactly as she had warned Richard 5 years ago, would cause catastrophic failures under emergency conditions. Richard stood directly behind Grace now, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, mixing with the sharp scent of his fear. His voice came out cold and threatening despite the desperation underneath. Move faster. If my daughter dies because you are incompetent, I will personally ensure you are charged with negligent homicide and spend the rest of your miserable life in prison. The guests around them shifted uncomfortably at his words, but no one spoke up to object or suggest that perhaps threatening a woman trying to save his daughter was inappropriate. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the device, her fingers working quickly to access the diagnostic port hidden beneath the electrode panel. A woman in a diamond necklace that probably cost more than Grace had earned in her entire career leaned toward her companion and said in a stage whisper meant to be overheard that she could not believe Mr. Westwood was allowing this person to touch medical equipment, that surely this homeless woman would just make things worse, that someone should call the real paramedics before this turned into a lawsuit. Another man in a tuxedo nodded in agreement and suggested loudly that perhaps they should all step back in case this deranged woman became violent or tried to steal something. Grace felt each word like a physical blow, but she had survived 5 years of being treated as less than human, 5 years of people crossing the street to avoid her, 5 years of security guards ejecting her from public spaces, 5 years of strangers calling her lazy and worthless. She would not let their contempt stop her now, when a young woman's life hung in the balance. Dr. Harrison stopped his chest compressions long enough to lean over Grace's shoulder, his voice dripping with professional condescension. I am the chief of cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital, and I have been practicing emergency medicine for 23 years. You do not have any medical credentials, and you are not authorized to tamper with this device. Step away immediately before you cause further damage that could cost this young woman her life. Grace did not look up from her work, but her voice when she spoke carried an authority that came from absolute certainty in her expertise. I designed this device from the ground up, including every line of firmware code that controls the cardiac rhythm analysis algorithms. Right now it is stuck in a recursive loop between the QRS detection module and the shock advisory protocol, which creates a race condition that prevents the capacitor from charging. I can bypass the firmware lockout and force a manual hard reset that will restore basic functionality. But I need you to stop talking and let me concentrate. Her tone was not rude or aggressive, but simply matter of fact, the voice of an expert explaining technical reality to someone who lacked her specific knowledge. Dr. Harrison's face flushed red with humiliation at being spoken to this way in front of his peers by a woman in torn clothing, who smelled of garbage and unwashed skin. He opened his mouth to respond, but Richard cut him off with a sharp gesture, some instinct telling him that Grace knew exactly what she was talking about even if he hated admitting it. Richard's assistant Jessica stood nearby holding her phone, and Grace could hear the soft click of the camera recording video of this entire scene. Grace knew, without looking, that Richard had ordered documentation to protect himself, to have evidence he could use to blame her if Sophia died or to claim credit if she survived. The calculation was so perfectly in character for the man who had destroyed her that Grace almost laughed at the predictability. She pulled a small multi-tool from her jacket pocket, one of the few possessions she had kept through years of homelessness, because it occasionally allowed her to earn a few dollars doing repairs for shop owners who paid cash. Several guests gasped and stepped back as if she had pulled a weapon, and one man shouted for security. Grace ignored them and used the screwdriver attachment to carefully remove the safety panel covering the device's internal circuit board. Around her, the whispered conversations grew louder and more speculative. A woman said she heard that homeless people often suffered from mental illness and delusions, that this woman probably thought she was an engineer, but was actually just having a psychotic break. A man wondered aloud if they should place bets on whether Sophia would survive, and several people laughed nervously at the dark humor. Another guest suggested that this was probably all staged for publicity, that Richard had hired this homeless woman as part of some elaborate charity promotion to make himself look compassionate. No one seemed to consider that Grace might actually be exactly who she claimed to be, that education and expertise could exist in a person's society had thrown away. Grace located the firmware reset jumper on the circuit board, a tiny connector that required precise manipulation to trigger the manual override sequence she had designed as a failsafe during development. Her hands steadied as muscle memory took over, years of training and experience guiding her movements with the precision of a surgeon. She could hear Sophia's breathing growing more labored and irregular, could hear Dr. Harrison saying that the patient was going into full cardiac arrest, that they were losing her. Grace closed her eyes for just a moment and sent up a wordless prayer to whatever force governed the universe that she would not fail this young woman who bore no responsibility for her father's sins. Then she repositioned the jumper, held down the power button for exactly 7 seconds, and released it while simultaneously pressing the analyze button 3 times in rapid succession. The device went dark and silent. Everyone held their breath. Then the screen flickered to life, showing a clean boot sequence, the firmware loading in safe mode that bypassed all the corrupted modules. The speaker emitted a clear tone and the automated voice said calmly, "Unit ready, attach pads to patient, analyzing heart rhythm." Grace grabbed the electrode pads and ripped open Sophia's delicate silk dress to expose her chest, moving with efficiency born of countless training simulations. She placed the pads in the correct positions and stepped back. The device analyzed for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then the verdict, shock advised, stand clear. Grace looked directly at Dr. Harrison. "You need to press the shock button now." Richard pushed forward and grabbed Grace's shoulder roughly, spinning her around to face him. "How do I know you have not sabotaged this device? How do I know you are not trying to murder my daughter as revenge for what happened between us 5 years ago?" His fingers dug into her shoulder hard enough to leave bruises, and his face was contorted with rage and terror mixed together. Grace met his eyes steadily and spoke with devastating calm. "Mr. Westwood, if I wanted revenge, I could have walked away and let your daughter die from the failure of the device you insisted on launching despite my warnings. Instead, I am saving her life because that is who I am. I am an engineer who believes every human being deserves to live regardless of what their father has done. Now let go of me and let the doctor deliver the shock before you run out of time." For a moment, Richard seemed frozen, unable to process the moral clarity of her words. Then Jessica's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Westwood, let her go. She is trying to help." Richard released Grace and stepped back, his hands shaking. Dr. Harrison pressed the shock button. Sophia's body arched as the electrical current surged through her heart. The device analyzed again. "Shock advised, stand clear." Another shock. Then the device announced, "Normal rhythm detected, continue monitoring patient." Sophie gasped and her eyes fluttered open. The ballroom erupted in relieved applause and several people began crying with joy. Grace sat back on her heels, exhausted, feeling 5 years of pain and vindication washing over her in equal measure. Richard dropped to his knees beside Sophia, taking her hand and pressing it to his forehead as tears streamed down his face. The powerful billionaire who moments ago had been threatening Grace now looked like nothing more than a terrified father grateful his child still breathed. Paramedics arrived and began loading Sophia onto a stretcher for transport to the hospital. Grace started to stand up, her work done, ready to slip back out the service entrance in the night where she belonged. But Richard called out, "Wait." She turned to face him. His voice had lost all its earlier hostility and now carried only awareness. "You saved my daughter. I owe you a debt. Tell me what you want." Grace looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had taken everything from her, who had weaponized the legal system to destroy her reputation and her life, who even now could not bring himself to apologize or acknowledge what he had done. She thought about asking for money, for a job, for public vindication. Instead, she said simply, "I want a meal, just like I told your security guard." One meal, that is all. Richard's face showed confusion and perhaps the first hint of shame. One meal. That is all you want after saving Sophia's life. Grace felt a cold satisfaction at his discomfort. "No, Mr. Westwood, that is not all I want. I want you to acknowledge in front of all these people that this device that nearly killed your daughter is manufactured by your company, that it has the exact firmware flaw I warned you about 5 years ago, that you destroyed my career because I refused to approve a product I knew was dangerous. I want the truth spoken aloud." The ballroom went completely silent. Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, shock giving way to anger, giving way to calculation as he realized how thoroughly trapped he was. Grace continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. "5 years ago, I was Dr. Grace Chen, lead biomedical engineer on your flagship AED project. I identified critical safety flaws during testing and recommended delaying the launch. You ordered me to approve the device anyway because you did not want to lose market share or disappoint investors. When I refused, you manufactured evidence of fraud and espionage, had me fired and blacklisted, took my career and my family and my home. I have been living on the streets for 5 years because you valued profit over patient safety and over the life of the woman who had given you everything. Tonight your own daughter nearly died because of the decision you made to ignore my warnings." The guests stared at Richard with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Jessica stepped forward, her phone still recording. "Mr. Westwood, I worked in your documentation department and I saw those reports. Everything she is saying is true. I saw your notes ordering the team to rush production despite Dr. Chen's safety concerns." Several other people in the crowd began murmuring, some recognizing Grace's name from industry publications years ago, others pulling out their phones to search for information about the fraud case. Richard stood frozen, his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time as the truth he had buried for 5 years erupted into public view in front of 300 witnesses and dozens of recording phones. A man in a well-tailored suit pushed through the crowd, and Grace recognized him as Marcus Williams, one of her former colleagues from the engineering team. "Marcus, you were there, you remember." Marcus nodded, his face showing shame and relief in equal measure. "I remember everything, Grace. We all knew you were right about the firmware vulnerabilities. After you were fired, Mr. Westwood called a mandatory meeting and told us that if anyone spoke to you or corroborated your story, we would be terminated immediately and blacklisted just like you. He said you had stolen proprietary data, and we needed to protect the company. Most of us had families and mortgages, and we were scared. I am so sorry that I stayed silent. I have regretted it every single day for 5 years." Other engineers in the crowd began nodding, and one woman called out that she had quit Westwood Medical 2 years ago specifically because she could no longer work for a company that had treated Dr. Chen so horribly. The solidarity building in the room seemed to physically diminish Richard, making him appear smaller and older with each passing moment. A journalist in the crowd raised her voice to ask if Richard would like to comment on these allegations for the record, since she was covering the event for the New York Times. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His empire, built on innovation and reputation, was collapsing around him, and he seemed unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. Grace pulled from her jacket pocket the weathered leather notebook she had carried for 5 years. This contains my original design specifications for the AED system, including detailed documentation of every safety concern I raised. It has Richard Westwood's signature approving my design recommendations, and then his later note ordering me to sign off on the production version despite my written objections. I also have a USB drive and a safety deposit box containing complete email backups and internal documents proving that fraud evidence against me was manufactured. I have kept this evidence safe for 5 years, not because I was planning revenge, but because I knew someday the truth would need to be told. Today is that day. She opened the notebook to a page showing Richard's handwriting next to her technical diagrams. The note read clearly, "Grace, I understand your concerns, but we cannot delay launch. Sign off on current version. We will patch issues in the field later." She held it up so the nearby cameras could capture the image. Richard lunged forward, trying to grab the notebook, but Dr. Harrison and Marcus blocked him. Several guests began taking photos. Richard's voice came out strangled and desperate. "That notebook could be forged. Anyone could have written that." Jessica spoke up again. "Mr. Westwood, I can verify Dr. Chen's claims. I will provide copies of the original internal documents to authorities and to the press. I should have done this years ago, and I am ashamed I waited this long. I quit effective immediately." Several other Westwood medical employees in the crowd announced they were also resigning and would cooperate with any investigation. A woman in an elegant black gown stepped forward, and Grace recognized her as Patricia Morgan, a retired federal judge who had been featured in news stories about judicial ethics. Judge Morgan's voice carried authority that silenced the remaining whispers. "I have heard enough to believe that a serious miscarriage of justice occurred here. Dr. Chen, I am no longer on the bench, but I maintain strong connections in the legal community. I will personally contact the prosecutors and judges involved in your original case and request a formal review. What happened to you was wrong, and it needs to be made right." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion, the first real hope she had experienced in 5 long years suddenly blooming in her chest. A man introduced himself as David Chen, no relation, the CEO of a competing medical device company. "Dr. Chen, I remember reading your dissertation on cardiac rhythm analysis years ago. It was groundbreaking work. I would like to offer you a position as Chief Innovation Officer at my company with starting salary of $500,000 annually and full support for clearing your name. We need people with your integrity and expertise." Other offers began coming from various corners of the room, venture capitalists wanting to fund her own startup, hospitals wanting to hire her as a consultant, universities wanting her to teach. 5 years of being invisible and worthless, and now suddenly the entire world wanted to claim her. Richard finally found his voice again, but it came out weak and broken. "Grace, I made a terrible mistake. I let greed and ego blind me to what was right. I destroyed you because I was afraid of being proven wrong, afraid of losing money and reputation. Tonight my own daughter almost died because of my arrogance. You had every right to walk away and let her die, but you saved her anyway. That makes you a better person than I ever was. I will withdraw from leadership of Westwood Medical. I will fund whatever legal efforts are needed to clear your name. I will make a public statement admitting what I did. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Grace studied him for a long moment, this man who had been her mentor and then her destroyer. Part of her wanted to reject his apology as too little and too late. But she thought about Sophia, about the young woman who deserved a father who had learned from his mistakes. "I do not forgive you easily, Mr. Westwood. You took 5 years of my life. But I accept that you are finally acknowledging the truth." She turned to address the entire ballroom. "I want everyone here to understand that what happened to me happens to countless others, particularly women and people of color in male-dominated fields. When we speak up about safety or ethics, we are punished and silenced. This has to change." The crowd broke into sustained applause and several people wiped away tears. A photographer from New York Magazine asked Grace to pose with her notebook, and she agreed, standing tall despite her torn clothes and dirty face, holding the evidence that would restore her life. Grace made the decision in that moment, standing in the grand ballroom, surrounded by Manhattan's elite, that she would not simply accept Richard Vade's vague promises and disappear back into the night. She had spent 5 years invisible and powerless, and now she stood at the center of attention with evidence in her hands and witnesses all around who had finally heard the truth. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a strength that surprised even herself. "Mr. Westwood, I appreciate your words, but words are cheap. I need concrete action starting right now, tonight. I want you to issue a public statement to these journalists admitting that you manufactured false evidence to destroy my career because I refuse to approve an unsafe medical device. I want you to commit in writing to funding a full legal team to overturn my wrongful termination case and clear my name with every professional licensing board that blacklisted me. I want you to establish a whistleblower protection fund of $10 million for other engineers and scientists who face retaliation for speaking up about safety concerns. And I want all of this documented and witnessed before I leave this building. Richard stood speechless, clearly not expecting Grace to make such specific demands, but the crowd began nodding and several people called out their support. Jessica stepped forward with her phone. I will document everything Mr. Westwood agrees to tonight, and I will serve as a witness to ensure he follows through. Judge Morgan added her voice. I will personally oversee the legal process to review Dr. Chen's case, and I will make sure justice is served properly this time. The pressure on Richard was overwhelming, and Grace could see him calculating whether resistance would only make things worse for him. Richard walked slowly to the podium that had been set up for his charity speech earlier in the evening, and Grace followed him with the notebook still clutched in her hands. The journalists in the crowd pressed forward with cameras and recording devices, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Richard gripped the podium with both hands and for a long moment simply stared down at the microphone as if trying to find words adequate to the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper at first, but it strengthened as he continued. 5 years ago, I made decisions that I justified at the time as being in the best interests of my company and our shareholders, but which I now recognize were fundamentally wrong and caused tremendous harm to an innocent woman. Dr. Grace Chen was the lead biomedical engineer on our ED project, and she identified critical safety flaws during the testing phase. She recommended delaying our product launch to fix those flaws. I overruled her recommendation because I did not want to lose market position and disappoint investors. When Dr. Chen refused to approve the device, I ordered my legal team and human resources department to manufacture evidence of fraud and corporate espionage. We falsified documents, manipulated digital records, and created a false narrative that Dr. Chen had stolen proprietary information to sell to competitors. None of it was true. We destroyed her career, her reputation, and her life because I valued profit over both patient safety and basic human decency. Tonight, my own daughter nearly died because the device I forced into production contained exactly the flaws Dr. Chen had warned me about. She saved Sophia's life despite having every reason to walk away and let me face the consequences of my own decisions. That act of grace and professionalism stands in stark contrast to my own behavior. The ballroom was completely silent except for the clicking of camera shutters and the quiet sound of people crying. Grace stood off to the side watching Richard's face as he made this public confession, and she tried to sort through the complex emotions flooding through her. Part of her felt vindicated and triumphant. Part of her felt angry that it had taken his daughter, nearly dying for him, to finally tell the truth. Part of her felt an unexpected sadness for the man Richard might have been if he had chosen integrity over greed 5 years ago. Richard continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each sentence as if the act of confession was liberating something in him that had been locked away. I am announcing tonight that I am stepping down immediately as CEO of Westwood Medical Empire. I am appointing an independent board to review all of our products for safety concerns that may have been ignored or suppressed. I am committing $10 million to establish the Grace Chen Whistleblower Protection Fund to support engineers and scientists who face retaliation for raising safety or ethical concerns in their workplaces. I am hiring the law firm of Morrison and Associates to represent Dr. Chen in overturning her wrongful termination case and clearing her name with all professional licensing boards. All of these commitments will be documented in writing tonight before these witnesses, and I will sign legally binding agreements to ensure I follow through. He paused and looked directly at Grace. Dr. Chen, I cannot give you back the 5 years I took from you. I cannot undo the pain and suffering I caused. But I commit to spending the rest of my life trying to make amends and to being a better man than I was. Grace walked to the podium and stood beside Richard, and for a moment they were just two people who had shared a history of mentorship and betrayal and now stood at a crossroads neither had anticipated. She spoke into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. I want everyone watching to understand that what happened to me is not unique. Women and people of color in STEM fields face retaliation regularly when we speak up about problems or challenge powerful people. We are told we are not team players, we are too emotional, we are troublemakers. We are pushed out of careers we worked decades to build. Our contributions are erased and our warnings are ignored until disasters happen. Then suddenly everyone wonders why no one spoke up sooner. But the truth is we did speak up and we were punished for it. The system is designed to protect powerful people and institutions rather than to protect truth and safety. Tonight I got justice, but only because extraordinary circumstances brought me face to face with the man who wronged me at the exact moment when he needed my expertise. Most people in my situation never get that chance. So yes, I accept Mr. Westwood's commitments, and I will hold him accountable for following through. But I also call on everyone in this room, everyone watching this video online, everyone who has power in corporations or government or institutions to commit to protecting whistleblowers and to listening when people raise concerns, even if those concerns are inconvenient or expensive to address. Lives depend on it. The crowd erupted in sustained applause and Grace felt tears running down her face, years of suppressed emotion finally breaking through the walls she had built to survive. Jessica approached with a tablet and a contract she had quickly drafted using a template from Westwood Medical's legal files. This covers all of Mr. Westwood's commitments, including the legal representation, the whistleblower fund, and the public statements. I have included provisions for substantial financial penalties if he fails to follow through on any element. Multiple witnesses will sign as well to verify the agreement. Grace read through the contract carefully, her engineering training making her naturally attentive to details and potential loopholes. She suggested several modifications to strengthen the language and Jessica made the changes immediately. Richard signed first, his signature shaky but clear. Then Grace signed. Then Judge Morgan, Jessica, Marcus, Dr. Harrison, and a dozen other witnesses added their signatures. The New York Times journalist photographed every page of the document. A lawyer in the crowd volunteered to file the agreement with the court first thing Monday morning to make it a legally enforceable contract. Another attorney offered to represent Grace pro bono in any future legal proceedings. Grace felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people who had been complete strangers 30 minutes ago, but who now seemed determined to ensure justice was fully served. She realized that her story had touched something deep in many of these successful people, perhaps reminding them of times they had stayed silent when they should have spoken up, or times they had witnessed injustice and looked away. David Chen, the CEO who had offered Grace the position at his medical device company, approached with a business card and a warm smile. Dr. Chen, my offer stands and I hope you will seriously consider it. We need leaders with your integrity and expertise. But I also understand if you need time to process everything that has happened tonight and to consider all your options. Please call me when you are ready. Grace took the card with trembling hands, struggling to believe that she was holding a business card again after 5 years of having no professional identity. Other offers continued to come through the next hour as the gala slowly wound down and guests began to depart. A venture capitalist wanted to fund her own medical device startup with her as the founder and CEO. A university dean wanted her to lead their biomedical engineering department. A hospital system wanted her as their chief safety officer. Several former colleagues from other companies apologized for not standing up for her 5 years ago and offered to serve as references or provide testimony about her character and expertise. Grace accepted business cards and contact information from dozens of people, stuffing them into her jacket pockets until she ran out of room. She felt dizzy with possibility, with the sudden reversal of fortune that seemed almost too dramatic to be real. Sophia was wheeled back into the ballroom by paramedics who had stabilized her condition and determined she was well enough to stay at the venue for a short time before transport to the hospital for overnight observation. She asked to speak with Grace, and the medical team brought her stretcher clothes to where Grace stood. Sophia's face was pale, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Dr. Chen, thank you for saving my life. I heard some of what was said while I was lying there, and I heard more from the paramedics who filled me in. I am horrified by what my father did to you, and I want you to know that I will use my trust fund and my position in the family to support your vindication in any way I can. I am also going to work to transform Westwood Medical into a company that actually lives up to the values my father claimed to have, but never followed." Grace knelt beside the stretcher and took Sophia's hand gently. "You are not responsible for your father's actions. You were a child when all of this happened. But I appreciate your support, and I believe you have the strength and integrity to create positive change. Use this experience to become the kind of leader the world needs." Sophia nodded and squeezed Grace's hand. "I will, I promise. And I am establishing a scholarship fund for women and students of color studying biomedical engineering, and I am naming it after you." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion at this gesture from a young woman who had just survived a near-death experience but was already thinking about how to help others. As the crowd thinned and hotel staff began cleaning up from the gala, Grace found herself standing alone for a moment in a quiet corner of the ballroom. She looked down at her torn clothes and dirty hands and realized that despite everything that had just happened, she was still technically homeless with nowhere to go when she left this building. The contrast between her sudden professional vindication and her continued poverty felt surreal and disorienting. Jessica approached carrying a large shopping bag. "Dr. Chen, I took the liberty of going to the hotel boutique and purchasing some clean clothes for you, and I have booked you a suit here at the plaza for the next month, all charged to Westwood Medical corporate account. I also have $5,000 in cash that I withdrew from the company emergency fund. Consider it a small advance on the much larger compensation you deserve. You should not have to go back to the streets tonight, not after everything you have been through, and everything you have given." Grace stared at the shopping bag and the envelope of cash that Jessica pressed into her hands, and suddenly the reality of what had happened crashed over her in a wave that buckled her knees. Jessica caught her arm and steadied her. "It is okay, let it out. You have earned the right to feel everything." Grace sobbed, 5 years of suppressed pain and fear and humiliation pouring out in great heaving gasps that shook her entire body. Jessica held her and let her cry, and several other people who had stayed late came over to offer comfort and support. Grace eventually composed herself and accepted Jessica's offerings with profound gratitude. She went upstairs to the suite that had been booked in her name, a space more luxurious than anywhere she had slept in 5 years. The bathroom alone was larger than some of the subway alcoves where she had spent nights huddled against the cold. She stood under the hot shower for nearly an hour, washing away layers of street grime and letting the water mix with her tears. She put on the clean clothes Jessica had bought, simple but well-made pants and a sweater that fit reasonably well. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, someone who existed in a strange liminal space between her old life and her new life, between Dr. Grace Chen, the successful engineer, and Grace, the homeless woman, and whoever she was becoming now. She ordered room service, her first real meal in months that was not scavenged from dumpsters or accepted from charity organizations. The food tasted almost too rich and complex after years of simple survival eating. She sat by the window looking out at the Manhattan skyline, at the lights of millions of people living their lives, and she tried to process the impossible events of this night. Tomorrow she would wake up and begin the work of rebuilding her life properly, of working with lawyers and colleagues to restore her reputation and create a new career. But tonight she simply existed in this moment of transition, grateful to be alive and validated and seen. The next morning Grace woke disoriented in the hotel bed, momentarily panicked because she could not remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory returned in a rush and she grabbed her phone to check if last night had been real or some elaborate dream her desperate mind had constructed. Her phone showed dozens of messages and notifications. News articles about the gala incident had gone viral overnight. The New York Times had published a breaking news story with the headline "Homeless Engineer Exposes Billionaire's Corporate Fraud After Saving His Daughter's Life." The article included photos of Grace holding her notebook, Richard making his confession at the podium, and the signed contract witnessed by prominent members of New York society. Social media was flooded with people sharing the story and expressing outrage at what had been done to Grace. Several hashtags were trending, including hashtag Justice for Dr. Chen and hashtag Protect Whistleblowers. Grace scrolled through hundreds of messages of support from strangers, from former colleagues, from professional organizations, and from journalists requesting interviews. Her story had struck a nerve that resonated far beyond her individual case, touching on broader issues of corporate accountability, racial and gender discrimination, and the treatment of whistleblowers. She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the understanding that she now had a platform and a voice that she needed to use wisely. Judge Morgan called Grace mid-morning to inform her that she had already been in contact with the prosecutors and judges involved in the original fraud case from 5 years ago. The legal review process is moving forward faster than I expected because the video of Richard Westwood's confession has created enormous public pressure for swift action. I expect we will have your conviction formally overturned within 30 days, and the professional licensing boards will be required to expunge all negative findings from your record. You will be fully restored to good standing in your profession. Additionally, several former Westwood medical employees have come forward overnight with additional evidence supporting your claims and contradicting the false narrative that was constructed against you. The case against you is completely falling apart. Grace felt relief wash over her so powerfully that she had to sit down. 30 days. After 5 years of carrying the weight of a false criminal record, after 5 years of being labeled a fraud and a thief, she would finally be cleared. Judge Morgan continued, I also want you to know that the federal prosecutors are opening a criminal investigation into Richard Westwood and others involved in the conspiracy to manufacture evidence against you. While I know you may have mixed feelings about that given his public confession and commitments, the law requires that corporate fraud and witness tampering be prosecuted. Grace considered this information carefully. I do not want vengeance, Judge Morgan, but I do want accountability. If criminal charges are appropriate, then I support that process. Marcus Williams called later that afternoon to tell Grace that 7 senior engineers from Westwood Medical had resigned in the past 12 hours, all citing ethical concerns and all offering to testify about the toxic culture that had punished dissent and prioritized profit over safety. We are forming a coalition of former Westwood employees who want to support your vindication and push for broader reforms in medical device regulation. We are calling ourselves Engineers for Patient Safety First, and we would be honored if you would serve as our founding director. Grace was moved by this gesture, but also cautious. Marcus, I appreciate this more than I can express, but I need to be honest that I am still processing trauma from 5 years of homelessness, and I am not sure I am ready to take on leadership of a new organization. Marcus' voice was warm and understanding. I completely understand, Grace. The offer stands whenever you are ready. In the meantime, we will do the organizational work and we will be here to support whatever path you choose for your recovery and your career. Just know that you are not alone anymore. Many of us are committed to making sure what happened to you never happens to another engineer or scientist who tries to do the right thing. Grace thanked him and ended the call feeling grateful for the solidarity, but also aware that she needed to take time for her own healing before she could effectively help others. David Chen, the CEO who had offered her the position at his medical device company, invited Grace to lunch at a restaurant near the plaza. Over salads and coffee, he laid out his vision for the role he wanted her to fill. "We are developing next-generation cardiac monitoring technology, and we need someone with your expertise to lead the innovation team. But more than that, we need someone with your integrity to shape our company culture and ensure we never cut corners on safety or ethics." "I will be completely honest with you, Dr. Chen. Part of my motivation for hiring you is that your story has generated enormous positive publicity, and having you on our team will enhance our reputation. A good fit." She asked for a week to consider the offer along with the other opportunities that had come her way, and David agreed readily. That evening, Grace received an unexpected visitor at her hotel suite. Richard Westwood appeared at her door looking exhausted and smaller somehow than he had seemed at the gala. "May I have 5 minutes of your time, Dr. Chen? I will leave immediately if you say no." Grace considered turning him away, but curiosity won out. She let him in but left the door slightly ajar and positioned herself near it. Richard stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his hands clasped in front of him like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "I came to tell you that Sophia is home from the hospital and doing well. The doctors confirmed that your intervention saved her life, that she would have died if you had not fixed the device. I also came to tell you that I met with federal prosecutors today, and I have agreed to cooperate fully with their investigation. I will plead guilty to whatever charges they bring. I am not trying to escape consequences. Finally, I wanted to say that I have been in therapy for the first time in my life, and my therapist is helping me understand how my ego and my fear of being seen as fallible led me to hurt so many people. I do not expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I am genuinely trying to become a better person." Grace studied his face for a long moment, looking for signs of manipulation or performance, but she saw only genuine remorse and exhaustion. "Mr. Westwood, I appreciate you telling me this. Forgiveness is not something I can offer right now. Maybe someday. What I can tell you is that I hope your transformation is real, because the world needs fewer people who abuse power and more people who use their resources to create positive change." 6 months had passed since the night at the Plaza Hotel that changed everything, and Grace Chen stood in a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan watching Richard Westwood receive his sentence. He had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy to manufacture false evidence. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who had reviewed hundreds of pages of documentation about the case, pronounced the sentence with gravity that matched the severity of the crimes. "Mr. Westwood, you abused your position of power to destroy the career and life of a whistleblower who was trying to protect public safety. You manufactured evidence, corrupted legal processes, and caused immeasurable harm to Dr. Grace Chen while endangering countless patients who relied on your defective medical devices. I am sentencing you to 5 years in federal prison, suspended to 2 years of home confinement, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will pay $50 million in restitution to Dr. Chen for the harm you caused to her career, reputation, and quality of life. You will also perform 1,000 hours of community service working directly with homeless populations in New York City, including at shelters and job training programs. You will establish and fund the Grace Chen Whistleblower Protection Fund with an initial endowment of $10 million as previously agreed. Finally, you are permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company." The judge looked directly at Richard. "I am giving you an opportunity through community service to understand the humanity of the people you viewed as disposable. Use this sentence to become the person you should have been all along." Richard nodded silently, his face showing a mixture of shame and acceptance. Grace felt no triumph watching him receive his sentence, only a quiet sense that justice was being served in a way that balanced punishment with the possibility of genuine transformation. Grace had accepted the position as Chief Innovation Officer at MedTech Solutions, the company run by David Chen, and she now led a team of 40 engineers developing the next generation of cardiac emergency devices. Her first act in the role had been to establish the most rigorous safety testing protocols in the industry, protocols that prioritized patient safety over speed to market without exception. She worked from a spacious office in a modern building overlooking the Hudson River, but she kept her old weathered notebook on her desk as a reminder of where she had been and why her work mattered. The apartment she had rented in Brooklyn was modest by the standards of someone earning her salary, but to Grace it felt like a palace after 5 years of homelessness. She had furnished it simply with comfortable furniture and filled the bookshelves with engineering texts and novels she had missed reading during her years on the streets. Her son Marcus, now 14, had moved back in with her after the court reversed the custody arrangement based on her restored professional standing and stable housing. The first night he slept in his new bedroom, Grace had stood in the doorway watching him sleep, tears streaming down her face as she processed the miracle of having her child back. They were rebuilding their relationship slowly and carefully, both of them healing from the trauma of 5 years of separation. Marcus had struggled with anger and confusion about what had happened to his mother, and Grace had found a therapist who specialized in helping families recover from traumatic disruptions. Every Friday night they cooked dinner together, and Marcus told her about school and his friends, and Grace listened with gratitude for every ordinary moment. The legal process to clear Grace's name had moved with remarkable speed. Onechard's confession became public, and dozens of witnesses came forward with corroborating evidence. Judge Morgan had personally overseen the review that resulted in all charges against being formally dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be brought again. The professional licensing boards that had sanctioned her based on the fraudulent evidence issued public apologies and restored her credentials without restriction. The Bar Association that had declined her complaints against Westwood Medical's legal team 5 years ago opened investigations into the attorneys who had knowingly presented false evidence. Grace's reputation in the biomedical engineering community was not just restored but elevated, as her story became a rallying point for discussions about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and maintaining ethical standards in medical device development. She received invitations to speak at conferences around the world, and she accepted many of them because she believed her platform came with responsibility. She spoke not just about her own experience, but about the broader systemic issues that allowed powerful corporations to silence dissenting voices. She called for stronger whistleblower protection laws, independent safety review processes, and consequences for executives who prioritized profit over patient welfare. Her speeches resonated deeply with audiences who recognized similar patterns of corporate misconduct in their own industries. Marcus Williams and 6 other former Westwood medical engineers had successfully launched Engineers for Patient Safety First, and they had asked Grace to serve on their advisory board rather than as their director, respecting her need to focus on her own recovery and career. The organization had grown rapidly to include over 300 members across multiple industries, all committed to creating cultures where safety concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. They had successfully lobbied for new regulations requiring independent safety review panels for all medical devices before FDA approval, with at least one member of each panel having expertise in the specific technology being evaluated. They had established a legal defense fund that provided pro bono representation to whistleblowers facing retaliation, and they had already supported 12 engineers in various companies who had been fired or demoted after raising safety concerns. Grace attended their quarterly meetings and contributed to their policy recommendations, but she was careful to maintain boundaries that protected her own mental health. Her therapist had helped her understand that she did not have to save everyone or solve every problem related to corporate misconduct, that she could make her contribution while also allowing herself to heal and live a full life beyond her trauma. The balance was difficult to strike, but she was learning. Sophia Westwood had indeed established the scholarship fund she had promised on the night Grace saved her life. The Dr. Grace Chen Scholarship for Excellence in Biomedical Engineering provided full tuition, housing, and living expenses for 5 students each year, with priority given to women and students of color from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Sophia had personally endowed the fund with $20 million from her trust, ensuring it could operate in perpetuity. Sophia had also taken an active role in transforming Westwood Medical, working with the new CEO and board of directors to implement comprehensive ethics reforms. The company had recalled all devices containing the firmware vulnerabilities Grace had identified, at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, but with the acknowledgement that patient safety had to come before financial considerations. Westwood Medical had also established an independent ethics hotline where any employee could report safety concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation, with all reports reviewed by an external committee that included patient advocates and independent engineers. Sophia visited Grace quarterly to update her on the company's progress and to seek her advice on various initiatives. Their relationship had evolved into something resembling mentorship, with Grace providing guidance to the young woman who was earnestly trying to repair the damage her father had caused. Grace appreciated Sophia's genuine commitment, but also maintained appropriate distance, aware that some wounds took years to fully heal. Richard Westwood had begun serving his community service hours at the Manhattan Homeless Services Center, where Grace herself had stayed during some of her darkest nights on the streets. She had learned about this from the center's director, who called to ask if Grace would be comfortable with Richard serving there, or if she would prefer he be assigned elsewhere. Grace had thought carefully before responding. Let him serve there. Let him meet the people whose lives mirror what mine was. Let him understand that homeless people are not statistics or failures, but human beings with skills and stories and dignity. Richard worked 3 days a week at the center, serving meals, sorting donated clothing, and helping residents navigate the complex bureaucracy of social services applications. The director reported to Grace that Richard had been quiet and respectful, taking direction from staff without complaint, and that he seemed genuinely affected by the conversations he had with residents. Several residents had recognized him from news coverage, and some had confronted him angrily about his treatment of Grace, but Richard had accepted their anger without defensiveness and apologized sincerely. One resident, a former accountant who had lost everything in a bankruptcy caused by medical bills, had become something of an informal mentor to Richard, explaining the systemic failures that turned educated professionals into homeless people overnight. Grace had not gone to the center since Richard began serving there, not ready for that encounter, but she appreciated the reports that suggested he was learning the lessons the judge had intended. Grace had used a portion of the $50 million restitution payment to establish her own foundation focused on preventing homelessness among professionals who faced wrongful termination or other catastrophic career disruptions. The Grace Chen Second Chances Foundation provided emergency housing assistance, legal representation, mental health services, and job placement support to people who had been blacklisted or systematically excluded from their professions. She had hired Jessica, Richard's former assistant who had been crucial in exposing the truth, as the foundation's executive director. Jessica had proven to be brilliant at operations and fundraising, and she brought genuine passion to the mission based on her own guilt about having remained silent for so long. The foundation had helped 47 people in its first 6 months of operation, and Grace read every case file personally. She recognized her own story in many of them, people whose expertise and credentials meant nothing once they were labeled as troublemakers or frauds. One woman, a former chemistry professor who had been fired after reporting research misconduct, and then blacklisted throughout academia, wept in Grace's office when she learned the foundation would cover her legal fees to fight the wrongful termination and provide housing assistance while the case proceeded. Grace told her what she wished someone had told her 5 years ago. That being right mattered even when it cost everything, and that justice sometimes took time but was worth fighting for. On a warm Saturday morning in early autumn, Grace stood on the stage at a biomedical engineering conference in Boston addressing an audience of 2,000 professionals, students, and industry leaders. She wore a tailored navy suit that fit perfectly, her hair was styled professionally, and she spoke with confidence that came from absolute certainty in her message and her worth. I want to tell you something that took me 5 years of homelessness to fully understand. Your value as an engineer and as a human being is not determined by your employment status, your salary, your professional credentials, or the approval of powerful people. Your value comes from your integrity, your expertise, your commitment to truth, and your willingness to stand up for what is right even when it costs you everything. 5 years ago, I lost my career, my home, my family, and my reputation because I refused to approve a medical device I knew could kill people. I lived on the streets. I ate from dumpsters. I was invisible to most of society. But I never stopped being Dr. Grace Chen, biomedical engineer, and I never stopped knowing that I had made the right choice. When Richard Westwood's daughter collapsed at that gala, the device that failed was exactly the one I had warned about, and I was the only person in that room who could fix it. That moment vindicated 5 years of suffering, but more importantly, it proved that speaking truth to power is not naive idealism, but essential responsibility. The audience listened in absolute silence, many people visibly emotional. Grace continued speaking, her voice growing stronger as she moved toward her conclusion. I know many of you in this audience have faced pressure to cut corners, to approve designs you know are flawed, to stay silent about safety concerns because speaking up might cost you your job or your career advancement. I am here to tell you that the temporary security of keeping your job by compromising your ethics is not worth the long-term cost to your soul and to the people whose lives depend on your work. Yes, whistleblowers often pay terrible prices. Yes, the system is designed to punish dissent and protect powerful institutions. Yes, you might lose everything like I did. But you will keep yourself, and that matters more than anything else. And increasingly, because of the work many of us are doing to strengthen whistleblower protections and change corporate cultures, speaking up is becoming safer and more supported. We are building a world where doing the right thing is not career suicide, but career responsibility. She paused and looked out at the sea of faces. I challenge every person in this room, whether you are a student just starting your career or an executive leading a major corporation, to commit today to prioritizing safety over profit, truth over convenience, and justice over institutional loyalty. If you see something unsafe, say something. If you witness misconduct, report it. If you are asked to compromise your principles, refuse. And if you face retaliation for doing the right thing, know that there are people and organizations ready to support you. You are not alone. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes, and Grace stood at the podium with tears running down her face, overwhelmed by the response and by how far she had come. After the conference, Grace met privately with a group of 15 engineering students who had requested time with her to discuss their career concerns and ethical questions. They gathered in a small conference room and Grace sat among them rather than at the head of the table, wanting the conversation to feel collaborative rather than hierarchical. A young black woman named Amara spoke first, her voice hesitant but determined. Dr. Chen, I am graduating next semester, and I have been offered a position at a company that I know has had problems with safety violations in the past. The salary is much better than my other offers, and I have student loans to pay. How do I know if I should take it or if I would be compromising myself? Grace considered the question carefully before responding. I cannot tell you what to do, but I can share what I learned. Do research on the company's current leadership and their commitment to ethics. asked during the interview process about their safety protocols and whistleblower protections. Trust your instincts about whether the culture feels right, and understand that you can take a job and still maintain your boundaries and principles. You can be the person who insists on doing things the right way, even in an imperfect environment. But also know that if you see serious safety violations, you will have to make hard choices. The students nodded, and several others shared their own ethical dilemmas and concerns. Grace spent 2 hours with them, offering perspective and encouragement, and she left feeling hopeful about the next generation of engineers who were thinking seriously about these issues before they even entered the workforce. That evening, Grace had dinner with Marcus at a restaurant near their apartment, and they sat across from each other in a comfortable booth, talking about his plans for high school and his growing interest in environmental science. "Mom, do you ever regret what happened? I mean, I know you did the right thing, but do you wish you had just approved the device and kept your job so we could have stayed together?" Grace looked at her son's earnest face and chose her words carefully. "Marcus, I regret that we were separated and that you had to go through that pain. I regret that you lost years with me because of choices I made. But I do not regret refusing to approve a device that could have killed people. If I had approved it and someone died, I could not have lived with myself. And I would have taught you that principles can be abandoned when they become inconvenient, and that is not a lesson I wanted you to learn. What happened to us was unjust, and it was caused by Richard Westwood's corruption, not by my integrity. I hope you can understand that distinction." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I do. My friends at school think you are like a superhero, standing up to a billionaire. But I just think you are my mom, and I am glad you are back." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I am glad I am back too, sweetheart. More glad than I can ever express." They finished their dinner and walked home through the Brooklyn neighborhood that was becoming familiar and comfortable, and Grace felt a contentment she had not experienced in years. 3 months later, Grace received a letter from Richard Westwood, forwarded to her office by her assistant, who knew to screen his communications and only pass them along if Grace indicated she was ready to receive them. Grace set the letter aside for several days before finally opening it one quiet evening. The handwriting was Richard's distinctive script, and the letter was several pages long. "Dear Grace," he wrote, "I am writing to you not because I expect a response or forgiveness, but because my therapist has suggested that I owe you a full accounting of my thinking and actions from 5 years ago, written with the honesty I should have had then. When you first presented your findings about the firmware vulnerabilities, I felt threatened. You were challenging my judgment and my timeline, and I interpreted that as disloyalty and insubordination rather than as the expert advice it was. I have built my entire identity on being right, on being the smartest person in the room, and your technical expertise and moral clarity exposed my limitations in ways I could not tolerate. So I destroyed you. I wish I could say it happened impulsively or that I did not fully understand what I was doing, but that would be another lie. I made deliberate choices to manufacture evidence, to manipulate legal processes, and to systematically erase your career because I valued my ego and my money more than your humanity or patient safety. I watched you lose everything, and I felt justified because I had convinced myself you were the problem rather than the solution." Grace read the entire letter, which continued with detailed acknowledgement of specific harms he had caused and specific lies he had told. He wrote about his community service at the homeless shelter and the conversations that had opened his eyes to the reality of the people he had dismissed as failures. He wrote about his relationship with Sophia and her determination to ensure the family legacy became one of redemption rather than exploitation. He ended by writing, "I do not ask for your forgiveness because I do not deserve it. I only ask that you know I see clearly now what I could not or would not see then. You were right about everything, and I was wrong about everything that mattered." Grace set the letter down and sat quietly for a long time processing her reactions. She felt some satisfaction that Richard truly understood his wrongs. She felt some continued anger that it had taken so much destruction for him to learn these lessons. She felt some unexpected compassion for the broken man he had revealed himself to be. She did not write back, not yet, but she kept a letter in her desk drawer, alongside her old notebook, documents of a chapter of her life that had closed but whose lessons remained relevant. 1 year after the night at the Plaza Hotel, Grace returned to speak at another charity gala, this time one organized by Engineers for Patient Safety First to raise funds for their whistleblower defense initiatives. The event was held at a smaller venue than the Plaza, but was filled with people who believed in the mission and who had contributed their time and resources to creating systemic change. Grace was the keynote speaker, and she stood at the podium wearing a dress she had chosen herself, her hair styled the way she liked it, her voice clear and strong. She began by acknowledging everyone in the room who had supported her recovery and her advocacy work. Then she spoke directly to the core message she wanted to leave with this community. Whistleblowing works. Despite all the risks and despite all the retaliation that whistleblowers face, speaking truth to power works because it exposes corruption that would otherwise remain hidden, and it sparks changes that protect future victims. My story ended with vindication, but that is not the only measure of success. Even if I had never been cleared, even if I had died homeless and forgotten, I would still have been right about that device, and my warnings would still have mattered. We cannot make speaking up contingent on guarantees of personal redemption. We have to speak up because it is right, period. But we also have to build systems that make speaking up safer and more supported. And that is what this organization does. She continued by sharing stories of other whistleblowers who had been supported by Engineers for Patient Safety First, people whose courage had prevented harm, even though most of them never received public recognition. Grace concluded her speech by sharing 3 specific calls to action. First, she asked everyone in attendance who worked in technical fields to commit to never compromising safety for convenience or profit, and to document and report any pressure they faced to do so. Have you or someone you know experienced workplace pressure to compromise safety or ethics? Share your story in the comments section of our website so others know they are not alone. Your voice matters, and your experience can inspire others to stand strong. Second, she asked everyone to support whistleblower protection legislation at both state and federal levels by contacting their representatives and making it clear that voters cared about these issues. If this story touched you and made you think about the importance of protecting people who speak truth to power, please subscribe to our newsletter for updates on advocacy efforts and ways you can make a difference. Third, she asked everyone to actively create cultures of ethical responsibility in their own workplaces and communities by modeling integrity and supporting people who raised concerns. She gestured to a screen behind her where information about upcoming initiatives and volunteer opportunities appeared. Click on the volunteer link on your screen right now to learn about other powerful stories of whistleblowers who changed their industries and their communities, and to find out how you can join this movement for accountability and justice. The audience applauded enthusiastically, and many people immediately pulled out their phones to access the website and sign up for the newsletter. Grace left the stage feeling that she had moved from being a victim who received justice to being an advocate who created justice for others, and that transformation felt like the most important outcome of everything she had endured.